On Saturday morning, June 24, the world woke up to the news that a coup was underway in Russia. The Wagner Group was moving on Moscow, and the Russian dictator, Vladimir Putin, would be ousted and brought to justice. The Ukraine war would be over, and Russia would be defeated and tamed. That very morning, early morning, I said that this was a psychological operation, a psy-op. And then there was a tremendous twist in the tale. So, what has changed? Who holds the advantage? Has Putin's stature suffered? Does he now appear weak? Has he lost credibility in Russia? Is a regime change imminent? Is Putin doomed? Please subscribe and let's find out. So, this coup attempt, this mutiny revolves around Yevgeny Prigozhin and his Wagner Group. So, we have to understand who this gentleman is and what that group is, because that's the crux of the entire matter. That's the backstory. So, the Wagner Group is a Russian paramilitary organization. It has been variously described as a private military company, a network of mercenaries, and also as a private army of Russia's President Vladimir Putin. Its owner is Yevgeny Prigozhin, who has in the past been called Putin's chef because in the past, a long, long time ago, he provided catering for the Kremlin. Before the Ukraine conflict, Wagner had about 5,000 soldiers who were experienced former soldiers from Russia's elite regiments and special forces. The first operation in which Wagner was involved was helping Russia conquer Crimea from Ukraine in 2014. Now, today, Wagner commands about 50,000 fighters in Ukraine. It's been a key component of the Ukraine campaign of Russia, and about 80% of Wagner's troops in Ukraine have been drawn from prisons. So, Wagner was the principal Russian force involved in operations in the so called Bakhmut meat grinder, the Battle of Bakhmut, which began on the 1st of August 2022 last year. Now, around the 5th of May this year, Yevgeny Prigozhin announced that his fighters will all leave the city of Bakhmut on the 10th of May because of a crippling shortage of ammunition. Prigozhin released an extremely harsh and critical and apoplectic and scathing video showing a large number of dead Wagner soldiers, and he excoriated the Minister of Defense Sergei Shoigu and the Chief of the General Staff Valery Gerasimov for starving Wagner of ammunition and supplies. He was extremely critical and he used profanities liberally in that video. And in response to that, the head of the Chechen Republic, Ramzan Akhmatovich Kadyrov, announced that his Chechen soldiers would replace Wagner in Bakhmut. So cracks were beginning to appear in the Russian military. There was a clear loss of morale, and the President Vladimir Putin appeared to have completely lost control of what was happening in Ukraine. And then by May 20, in just a couple of weeks, Wagner had not only not withdrawn from Bakhmut, but they had cleared the last Ukrainian defenders and they had won the Battle of Bakhmut after 224 days. So Prigozhin's announcement, his video, his apparent running out of ammunition, his apparent shooting of deserting Russian soldiers, his calling out of the Kremlin, his calling out Sergei Shoigu and Valery Gerasimov, the apparent confusion and loss of control, all of this was a masterful psychological operation, a psyop. It was an absolute masterclass in battlefield psyops. It will be studied in military colleges for decades to come. Prigozhin lured Kiev's forces into the Bakhmut trap. He kept the approach roads and the bridges open and he lured them in, he killed their generals, and he destroyed the Ukrainian forces that were trying to fight and save Bakhmut. And in doing so, Prigozhin preempted Ukraine's long promised spring counteroffensive that never really happened. It eventually happened in summer and it's been a total disaster. So, and then we come to mid-June 2023, which is just a couple of weeks ago. So in mid-June 23, the Ministry of Defense of Russia ordered the Wagner Group to sign contracts with them before the 1st of July. These contracts would effectively incorporate Wagner as a proper official subordinate into the regular military command structure, and this would reduce Yevgeny Prigozhin's influence on Wagner. Prigozhin refused to sign this deal, citing incompetence on the part of Sergei Shoigu. So this is the build-up to what happened on Friday night, 23rd of June. On that night, 23rd of June, Prigozhin called for an uprising against Russia's military leaders, primarily the two gentlemen with whom he has a long running feud, Sergei Shoigu, the Minister of Defense, and Valery Gerasimov, the Chief of the General Staff. Prigozhin claimed that the Russian generals had ordered an airstrike on his fighters, on the Wagner fighters in Ukraine, and a huge number of them had been killed. Of course, he did not provide any evidence. Prigozhin promised to go to the end to stop the Russian leadership's evil. He said that he had 25,000 fighters ready to battle the Russian army, and he also called on regular Russian soldiers to join in his coup attempt. Prigozhin said that his move was a march for justice against the Russian military leadership, but importantly, not against Vladimir Putin. And he said that we will destroy everything that gets in our way. His troops, the Wagner troops, then moved east into Russia's Rostov region. In response, Russian troops were put on high alert across the country. The Russian army deployed forces at key locations in Moscow, and there were reports of dozens of Russian aircraft and helicopters flying towards Rostov. Kremlin's security service, the FSB, opened a criminal case against Prigozhin and declared him to be a foreign agent, which is very interesting. We'll come back to that later. So they declared that he was a foreign agent, and they accused him of launching an armed rebellion inside Russia. They called upon Wagner Group members to arrest Prigozhin, and the deputy commander of Russia's Ukrainian campaign, General Sergei Surovikin, ordered Wagner troops to stand down. The next morning, on the 24th of June, Saturday, that morning, Wagner troops entered the city of Rostov-on-Don in southern Russia. This is a city that's located on the banks of the Don River. Prigozhin claimed that his soldiers shot down a Russian helicopter after it opened fire on civilians. But once again, no real hard evidence of this happening exists. Wagner also captured the headquarters of Russia's southern military district in Rostov, which serves as the main rear logistical hub for Russia's entire Ukraine invasion force. And Prigozhin told the military officers there to continue their work. He did not ask them to stop their work. Prigozhin said that 60 to 70 Russian soldiers had joined his coup attempt, and he claimed that fighting took place between his troops, the Wagner troops, and Russian troops, although this once again has not been confirmed. And video footage later showed Prigozhin in talks with two Russian generals. So this is about Saturday morning. The same morning, Wagner troops and convoys started moving northwards on the M4 highway towards Moscow. That same morning, President Putin gave an emergency TV address Saturday morning in response to these developments. He looked visibly angry. He said that Prigozhin's ambition had led to treason. He vowed to crush Prigozhin. He said that this mutiny was a knife in the back of our Russian people. He said it was a betrayal. He said that as a citizen of Russia, I will do everything to defend the country, and decisive action will be taken. Putin announced that a counter-terrorism regime was in place in Moscow and other Russian cities. Later that day, on Saturday, early in the day itself, the reports emerged claiming that Putin had fled Russia by plane. And the Kremlin strongly denied these reports, and now we know that Putin had never left Moscow. But these reports started emerging on Saturday morning. Prigozhin then responded to Putin's statement, saying that Putin was deeply mistaken to call Prigozhin and the Wagner forces traitors, and he added that he and his men would not surrender. Prigozhin described himself and the Wagner forces as true patriots in a direct response to Putin's statement. This is the first time that Prigozhin has actually responded to anything that Putin has said. So we're still in the morning of June 24, which is Saturday. So then in that same morning, the news broke early in the morning that an apparent coup is underway in Russia. Wagner has mutinied and they're marching on Moscow, and the world started reacting. That's when I saw this entire thing first, and I immediately tweeted and I said that this is a psychological operation. And the Western media and the various journalists and experts started reacting to this. The perpetual warmonger Anne Applebaum wrote in The Atlantic that Russia slides into civil war. The Western media started extolling the Wagner forces and calling them freedom fighters. And various geopolitical and other experts started weighing in and started saying that Putin's time was up, Putin would be overthrown, Russia would be free, Prigozhin would take Moscow and be the next president. They said that a new Russian revolution was happening. It was 1917 all over again. And may I remind you, I said it was a psychological operation. The Washington Post said that US spy agencies had picked up intelligence in mid June, around the time that the Russian Ministry of Defense asked the Wagner forces to become regular fighters. So, around this time, the US spy agencies apparently picked up intelligence that Prigozhin was planning an armed action against Putin. And this is what the Washington Post reported. And in response to all these events, the Chechen leader Ramzan Akhmadovich Kadyrov said that his forces were ready to help put down the mutiny and they were ready to use harsh methods if necessary. So Kadyrov showed support for Vladimir Putin. The Ukraine government tweeted, "We are watching." And Ukraine's president, Mr. Zelensky, said that Russia's weakness is obvious. And the longer Moscow keeps its troops in Ukraine, the more chaos it will invite back home. So everybody was waiting for the coup to succeed and for Mr. Putin to be overthrown and things to, go in the direction that they hoped for. And Ukraine's forces then they attempted to take advantage of this apparent chaos and confusion, and they tried to reboot their failed and overhyped summer offensive. They stepped up attacks along the front line in the Bakhmut region, in the Donbas region, in northern Bakhmut, etc., and they were beaten back badly. So there was no real confusion or disorder among the Russian troops. Meanwhile, Wagner forces and convoys were marching towards Moscow on the M4 highway. Anti-terrorist measures were launched in Moscow, but no real attempt was made to stop the Wagner forces. So it looked like it was simply a matter of time before Wagner reached Moscow and did whatever they wanted to do. It looked like they would encounter no resistance whatsoever. And then on Saturday evening, Alexander Lukashenko, the president or dictator of Belarus, whatever you want to call him, announced that he had brokered a last minute truce with Prigozhin that involved the Kremlin dropping its plans to abolish the Wagner military company. And as part of this agreement, all criminal charges against Wagner and against Prigozhin would be dropped, and Prigozhin would move to Belarus. Around 8:30 p.m. Moscow time that evening, Prigozhin said that the mutiny was over without shedding a single drop of blood. So Prigozhin and his Wagner forces that joined in the rebellion have allegedly been offered safe haven in Belarus. The exact terms of the agreement remain unclear as of now, and the remaining Wagner forces in Ukraine that did not join in the mutiny will be absorbed into Russia's military. The next day, 25th of June, which was Sunday, Prigozhin was reportedly seen in the Belarus capital, Minsk. Wagner forces were also in Belarus, north of Ukraine. So understand the situation. On June 24, Wagner forces were in the south of Moscow, 200 kilometers from Moscow, essentially a stone's throw away from Moscow. And the next day, 25th of June, Wagner forces were 100 kilometers from Kiev. They were in Belarus. Such a significant rerouting, redeployment of the Wagner forces. So, what we witnessed was a tremendously rapid redeployment of the Wagner forces in broad daylight, essentially, right in front of the world's eyes. They moved from the Donbas region in the southeast of Ukraine, and they went all the way north, and they were then in Belarus, north of Ukraine. And the Western world and the media watched the entire maneuver very closely, and they actually cheered it. And they portrayed the Wagner forces as freedom fighters. And then when news of this turnaround came out, the Western media went back to calling the Wagner forces as terrorists. So here's what happened overall. Wagner forces have now been redeployed to Belarus. Kiev now comes within range of the Wagner forces. Prigozhin is free. All criminal charges against him were dropped within 24 hours. There has been no fighting between Russian troops that can be proven. The Russian military is fully functional, it is fully intact, it is fully deployed. It is essentially business as usual in Russia. The Ukrainian offensive, counter-offensive, whatever you want to call it, has failed badly. They have not been able to take advantage of the apparent confusion and chaos. And most importantly, Putin is still fully in power. So what we have witnessed is an elaborate psychological operation, an elaborate psyop, even more elaborate than what happened in Bakhmut in May. The Western media has been played again by the same man, Prigozhin, again. And the effective outcome is that this was an elaborate, rapid redeployment of the Wagner forces masked by a fake coup attempt. And anyone who has seriously studied the conditions, the strategy, the planning, and the execution of coups knows that this was not a coup. If you want to understand how a coup really happens, read this book, Coup d'etat by Edward Luttwak. It's a coup d'etat, a practical handbook. That's the book you need to read to understand how a coup actually happens. So what we have witnessed was not a coup. So the US government was not fooled. NATO was not fooled. They kept very quiet. But the Western media was fooled. And geopolitical experts and analysts were all fooled. They all said it's a coup that we are witnessing in real time. And the Ukrainian government was also fooled. My assessment of Friday morning that this was a psychological operation turned out to be correct. So what now? What could happen now? So we could possibly be about to witness the next phase of the Ukraine conflict. The Belarus theater could now become active. We have to understand that Belarus is a Russian ally. It would not be inaccurate to call it a Russian vassal state. Belarus hosts Russian tactical nuclear weapons. They have been training with the Russian military, and they now host the Wagner forces as well. So we could very well witness a move on Kiev, maybe from the north in Belarus, involving the Wagner forces, or maybe simultaneously from Belarus in the north with the Wagner forces and from the Donbas region in the south with Russian regular forces as well. So this possibility has now opened up. And what about Prigozhin? What about Prigozhin's criticism of the Minister of Defense Sergei Shoigu and the Chief of General Staff Valery Gerasimov? Was that all a ploy or was it real? Are we going to witness more insubordination from Prigozhin against the Ministry of Defense, against the military, against Shoigu, against Gerasimov? Does this mean that Prigozhin is now a marked man? Does he now have a target on his back? Is Prigozhin in danger of meeting an untimely end? Well, time will tell us, but what I can state, what the facts are that Prigozhin has never criticized Vladimir Putin. Prigozhin has delivered the goods in Bakhmut. He delivered the Bakhmut victory for Russia. Overall, he has acted patriotically. He may have criticized certain individuals, he may have criticized parts of the military of Russia, but he has not acted against Russia overall. And as long as he's useful and as long as he's able to deliver results, he will most likely be fine. He will most likely be safe. So that most likely is the situation when it comes to Prigozhin, but you never know. But overall, for now, it's advantage Russia. The situation in the Ukraine conflict could now change very rapidly, and we're going to keep a close eye on the developments. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you very soon.